I'm sure that you're going to want to listen to it again. So for that purpose, it is being recorded, and we will put the link up on our FDCC on demand page. And you'll also get a copy of it on the next week's Friday Fives. I'd first of all like to thank the FDCC Foundation, who've made the opportunity of bringing Peter to us today, and also would like to thank our good friend Mark Harwell from Harwell Law Group in Chattanooga, Tennessee, for putting such a tremendous program together for our winter meeting. There is a chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. As Peter goes through his presentation today, if you don't mind, use that chat function to put in any questions you might have. Peter's going to stay with us at the end of his presentation, so to answer all of your questions. So please feel free to send those in. Since this is also a CLE program, you will also be seeing at various times a little button pop up, little box pop up in regard to the screen that you have in front of you. And that will be to make sure that all of the state CLE boards can know that we're all paying attention. You can drag that box over to your other screen if you have a second one, so it doesn't obstruct your view of Peter and his presentation, but please make sure that you answer those questions. They'll only be up for about 2 minutes time, because that will then enable us to go ahead and send those credit functions in to you. You can also go ahead and put your screen on speaker mode so that you can see all of what Peter is going to present. And at this point, I will turn over to our keynote speaker, who is a geopolitical strategist, which is a kind of a fancy way of saying he helps people understand how the world works. And having been with Mark Harwell and Peter on the phone a couple of times up into this week, I can tell you that we are in for a tremendous presentation today. Peter Zeihan really combines an expert understanding of demography, economics, energy, politics, technology, and security to help his clients and all of us today better prepare for what still is going to be quite an uncertain future. I remember Peter telling us a few weeks ago, forget about everything that you thought was going to happen. None of it is true. And you'll see why in a minute. Right, Peter?
Well, with that sort of introduction, I'm not quite sure where to go. Everybody, it's great to be back. Let's see here. Can we go ahead and do the screen share? Is it up? Yay, nay? I think it's up. Okay. I'm going to say a lot of things that are probably going to make a lot of people relatively uncomfortable today. So I want to start with something that's simple, something that we all agree on, something that's not controversial. So let's start with politics. The American political system is going through one of its periodic modes of shuffling. The factions that make up the parties are moving around. So rather than think of Republicans and Democrats, I think it's better to put it up on this matrix. So if you're on the right side, an economic conservative, you want the government out of your wallet. If you're on the top, a social liberal, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're on the left, an economic liberal, you want the government to have a bigger tax take in order to rearrange society in some way. And if you're at the bottom, a social conservative, then you think that the government should play a role in regulating social morality in some way. And of course, if you're in a corner, you can combine these. So if you're at the bottom left, a social conservative and economic liberal, you like guns and you like Medicare. And if you're at the top, you're a social liberal and economic conservative, you think that the primary purpose of government should be to bring all bureaucrats everywhere to Washington, build a giant nuclear bomb, and then detonate it while they're still in the city. We're all on here somewhere. Here are traditional swing voters in the American political system today. Here is the Democratic coalition that we've come to know. And here are the Republicans. And then here is everyone together. Now, we've had a lot of weird things going on recently, but the most specific outcomes that we've had is that the Trump administration, Donald Trump personally, has brought the populace of the conservative bent in from the cold. They didn't participate in most of the last 5 elections until Trump came along. And we're talking 10 to 20 million additional voters who had not been part of the system before now are. That makes them not simply the largest faction in the Republican Party, but the largest faction across the entire American political spectrum. And to think that they're just going to vanish now that they've had a taste of power, I think is silly. But for everyone that Trump attracted, he also drove people away. This is the math and maps crowd of the Republican coalition, if you will. Military voters, fiscal conservatives, business voters. Trump drove them all away. He had clashes with all of them at various times. National security voters, or the national security establishment, he basically used as a prop. Fiscal conservatives, he ran the biggest deficits we have seen since World War II. And his mismanagement of the coronavirus crisis drove the business community away. And he didn't simply disagree with these folks. He campaigned against them in the midterms. He campaigned against them when it was time for re-election. He drove them out of his White House, and he drove them out of the party's apparatus. They, for all intents and purposes, are now swing voters. Excuse me. But he was also able to draw other people to make up for the loss of numbers. Union voters are natural allies. They're anti-free trade, they're social conservatives, and in terms of rank and file voting, he captured them en masse. Catholics had a split between the more doctrinal group, the more secular group, and then the group that kind of sees itself in the evangelist light, where the attraction of political power and marrying that to social policy really attracted them, and they became some of his most diehard supporters. And then the Hispanics are always the big surprise to most people. Yes, illegal migrants, and yes, young Hispanics, and yes, first-generation Hispanic Americans tend to be on the left. But once they hit second generation, that changes. In the border states, Trump carried the majority of the Hispanic vote, particularly in the border counties themselves. And that is a bloc that almost won him the election. They've switched. So here is our current Republican coalition. Now, there's a lot going on the Democratic side too, not just because the unions have been in motion and the Hispanics have been in motion. The Team Biden has driven the socialists out of the Democratic coalition. Now, not only did Biden beat this faction's policies with a dead horse during the debates and the primaries, and not only did he bring Obama out of retirement to campaign against wokeness, but it was really Biden's selection of Kamala Harris to be his running mate that really changed the math, because the socialists hate her. She used to be a district attorney, and you may have disagreements with her on various policies, but she put a lot of people in prison, and that just made her a non-starter for most of the socialist camp. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, wait a minute, how can you tell me that Kamala Harris is basically a law and order Republican from the Vietnam era? Because that's kind of how she is. What about Portland? Well, let's talk about Portland. Now, this is exactly what it looks like. This is Darth Vader wearing a dress, riding a unicycle while playing a flame-breathing bagpipe. Portland's not normal. And Portland is not representative of what this country is, or representative of what this country might one day become. Portland is no representative of the United States than Disneyland is. And with the protests we saw last year that we all think of as being big and maybe a watershed, but if you factor out the first week in Minneapolis where it all started, and of course Portland, we never had more than 50,000 people on the streets at a time nationwide. It doesn't crack the top 10 for protest movements in American history. It's just that because of COVID, we were all wed to our screens, and anything that we saw became larger than life. Now, were the Black Lives Matter protests important? Sure. And can addressing them, and I mean addressing them, but everything from the Proud Boys to Antifa and everything in between, can addressing all that serve us in our cultural evolution and our national stability? Of course it can. But let's start with a little perspective. Anyway, that's where we are. Trump built a far larger and a far more cohesive social conservative Republican coalition, while the math and maps crowd were banished to the wilderness. And that's kind of where we were until January 6th. Now, we can go down any number of rabbit holes. There's a lot of lessons that happened on that day. But for purposes of this discussion of the evolution of American politics, the big takeaway is that the Republicans have proven unable or unwilling to separate themselves from the events of January 6th in specific, or Trump's inability to use or even protect law enforcement in general. That means that so long as Trump is involved with the party, the Republicans can no longer claim they are the law and order party. And the group in the American political system that is in play, that cares most about those issues, is the business community. And if you look at the folks that Biden has appointed so far, we've had about 3,500 appointments. One is a socialist, just one. And if you look at the people at the top, particularly at Treasury and Commerce, they're very pro-business. The Biden administration appears to be making a bid to include the business community in the new Republican coalition, or excuse me, the new Democratic coalition, which would make this the potential outcome. Now, I don't want anyone to get overly dejected or enthusiastic about these evolutions. There's still time for this to all shake out. We are in year 5 of what is normally an 8 to 12 year transition. It makes sense that we're seeing some outlines, but it hasn't gelled yet. But politics evolve. They follow changes in culture and economics and technology and geopolitics. We're dealing with the after effects of the Cold War and the rise of the digital age and a big wave of globalization and now deglobalization. Of course, we are going to manage our politics differently. Now, whether you love this or hate it, now is the time to act. If you're a business, national security, or fiscal conservative, and you want to remain a Republican, now is the time to act. You have a window of opportunity because not everybody in that solid oval thinks it's a great idea to march to the Capitol with a Confederate flag and a can of bear mace and beat a cop. If you're trying to reclaim your party, now's the time. If you wait 2 years, it'll probably be too late because we will be selecting candidates for the midterms a year from now. Okay, so that is where we are right now as a country internally. Let's briefly discuss where we've been. The United States created the global system in order to fight the Cold War. It was a bribe. We basically paid everyone to be on our side. We said that we would use our Navy to patrol the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could go out at any time and interact with any foreign partner, get any commodity, sell any product, participate in any supply chain, and to be able to do it all without needing a military escort for everything that they did. That had never happened before. We know that is globalization. We know that is free trade. In exchange, they had to be on our side to face down the Soviets. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And if the United States decides that it wants to continue this system, we need 3 things. First, we need a political culture that's bipartisan in nature, that is committed to globalization. Now, I personally would argue that that was long gone before January 6th. I'd say that was long gone before Trump. But right now, we don't even have a political culture. Rediscovering one will take time. It's going to be a big piece of this year and next year, but ultimately it's a 10-year transition. Now, let's assume for the moment that Biden is the guy. Personally, I don't. I mean, he couldn't even get his first bill through the Senate with a single Republican co-sponsor or vote, and 10 Republicans came to his office to ask how they could help. It's not a good sign. But let's assume for the moment that Biden's the guy. How long do you think it's going to take him to knit our cultural fabric back together? Come up with a plan to go out in the world and lead us there? A month? His whole term? More time than he has? You know, this isn't the sort of thing that is done overnight. This takes a decade. Until then, we're out. The second thing we would need is global interests. But the United States is the least involved economy in the world as a percent of GDP because the global system was a bribe. If we had actually invested in it and tried to make money off of it, it wouldn't have been a bribe. We would have just been another empire. It's not a popular sell. And then third, we would need a global military footprint in order to keep the peace, patrol the oceans, prevent interactions that could cause economic harm to the world. We have been slimming down the number of troops that we have abroad since the start of the Cold War. We're going to have fewer than 10,000 troops in the Middle East. Sorry, we have fewer than 10,000 troops in the entire Middle East now. We're going to be going down to 0 later this year. We haven't simply decided to leave. We've already left. Globalization is already over, and what's left is just running on inertia. So that's the strategic piece of this. And what is left is simply running on inertia. Let's talk about the numbers. Let's talk about the economics. This is a standard demographic profile. Children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Mortality tends to build it into a pyramid. Now, this is Mexico. This is what we consider to be a consumption-led system, because whenever you have a lot of people aged roughly 40 and below, it's all about raising kids and going to college and buying homes and cars. That consumption is what drives modern systems. And when American policymakers look at a system like Mexico, we really like what we see. Two things. First, people who are under age 40 are new on the job. Their value add is somewhat limited. And as a result, Mexico excels at low and mid-skill manufacturing and assembly. That's not what the American worker does. We do the design, we do the high end. So the propensity for integration between those systems is huge. Second, Mexicans are young, which means they buy a lot of product, which means they buy a lot of American product. Mexico became our largest trading partner in calendar year 2019, and if not for the COVID hiccup, they would be still today. They'll take that role back this year, and they will never give it up the rest of our lives. This is a partner. This is not. The Koreans had a baby bust 50 years ago. They never recovered. So they've got a lot of workers in their 50s and early 60s, folks with literally decades of expertise, very high value added, going head to head with the American worker. But there are no young Koreans, so that product has to be sold abroad, primarily here. We will always have a trade deficit with the Koreans. From roughly 1980 to roughly 2015, the world was in a beautiful demographic moment. Here we've got a number of major economies in the year 2000. Everyone was either like Mexico today, consumption-led, or like Korea today, export-led. And the balance was perfect to maximize integration and trade. So we saw the greatest expansion in trade, wealth, and personal incomes in human history. And it lasted an entire generation. That generation is what we're used to. That's our entire professional lives. But 20 years later, we're all 20 years old. The consumption-led systems are aging into export-led, and the export-led are aging out and becoming what I call post-growth. Look at China in particular. They had a baby bust that doubled down last year, their lowest birth rate ever. And remember, it takes 9 months for a kid to get born, which means that most of that birth rate drop was because of decisions made in 2019 before COVID. China is now the fastest aging society on the planet, the fastest aging society in human history. And at most, there will be 45% the population that they are today by the time we get to century's end. The global demographic of high consumption was already ending. It was already going to end the first half of this decade. Now, here in the United States, we're a partial exception, and it's largely because of what the baby boomers have done. Now, in some ways, the baby boomers are just like everybody else around the world. When their parents came home from the war, they started families. We had a baby boom. That's the boomers. And they're all aging at the same rate, and they're all retiring at the same time. And that changes the capital structure. So think of how you have invested in your life. When you're 35, you invest a very small sliver of a very small income for the future. When you're 55, you invest a very fat wedge of a much larger income. And when you're 64 3/4, every spare cent you have, you shove into your retirement savings. As you age, you invest a greater percentage and a greater volume. And then you retire and you stop. The velocity of money doesn't simply stop, it reverses because you have to liquidate your stocks and bonds and go into things like T-bills and cash. That cliff jump happens in calendar year 2022. We're only a year away from that. So we're experiencing the cheapest credit we've ever known, and very soon we're going to be experiencing the most expensive credit we've ever known. In that, the baby boomers are exactly the same. They were all born at the same time. But American baby boomers did one thing different from the rest of the world's boomer cadres. They had kids, they had the millennials. Now we can say whatever we want about the millennials, and there's so very much we can say about the millennials, but they've got one thing going for them that their cadres the world over don't. They exist. They're consuming today. Tomorrow they'll be investing. And that means the United States has a minimum of 20 more years to figure out what to do with the world of collapsing consumption than everybody else. Let me stack it up for you. Here are the world's consumption-led systems ranked by GDP, or stacked by GDP, as of the data we had from last year. Here's where they'll be in 10 years. It's a significant drop, about 15%. Here's the export-led systems. They vanish as a class. Today, we only have one post-growth economy, but very soon, we knew global consumption was going to peak in the first half of this decade. We knew that global capital supplies was going to peak next year, and we know that global production is peaking right now. None of them will recover in our lifetimes. And all that was before COVID. Now, all the consumption-led economies of the world are under some degree of lockdown and in some degree of recession, which means that it doesn't matter if you're export-led, you have no one to sell to. And that's the good news. We've got three variants that are now raging throughout the world. The first is the UK variant, which is more communicable by 50 to 80% based on whose math you're using. Now, as long as you get vaccinated, that's fine. The immune response that the vaccination generates is 10 times as good as what you get from natural immunity. It works versus this variant. It works versus all the variants. So as long as you can get your shots, you're good. But the new variant is already the dominant strain circulating in Europe and the United States. And by the time we get to the second week of April, it will be the dominant strain globally. Second, the very nature of the vaccination program is problematic. Because if you get one shot, but not the second one for whatever reason, you have created kind of a petri dish for the virus to learn and how to adapt. Now, again, in the United States, I'm not too worried. We're showing an excellent schedule for people getting both shots, well over 95%. But in the rest of the world, I'm very concerned. I mean, look at the United Kingdom. They've been giving out as many shots per person as we have, but they've prioritized getting one shot in everyone first. That's creating a breeding ground that we really don't need. Third, the South African variant is cross-communicable with rodents. And there are mice and rats in every city that humans live in, which means it's never going away because we can't eradicate those populations. So it will always be there on the edge, which means we will always need booster shots forever. And we will always have people in our communities who refuse to get the vaccines who will now be getting COVID over and over and over. The variant I'm most concerned about is the Brazilian one, because it at least in part bypasses pre-existing immunity. Now, again, if you can get the vaccine, you're fine. In fact, we're already testing in phase 3 trials booster vaccines that specifically address all known variants. But if you cannot get vaccinated by July 1st, this strain will be global. Which means that North America and only North America can recover soon. The Europeans will not be able to finish their vaccinations till the end of the year. Most of the developing world will not be able to start theirs until next year. And these variants, because of their insidiousness and because of their communicability, are likely to creep back into East Asia very easily. So North America recovers starting in the third quarter, and nobody else has a chance. Now, there are 5 vaccines that are out there right now. Oh, by the way, this is William Shakespeare. Like, literally, that's the dude's name. He's the second person in the UK to get the vaccine. Now, we've got 5 variants. The first 2, Pfizer and Moderna, these are the mRNA formula. They are, a lot of people have concerns about these because they think them of as new technology. They're not. They're actually based on technology that's 30 years old. This is gene therapy just in a shot form. Some folks are afraid it's going to alter your DNA or prevent you from having kids or change your kids. No, it doesn't do that. If you want to change somebody's genomic sequence, you have to inject them when they're a zygote. And while none of us are, always accused of acting our age, I don't think any of us are zygotes. The AstraZeneca one is the one that's been in the news of late because it's I don't know. There's some concerns that it doesn't work as well as people thought. I can't comment on that specifically. I can tell you that AZ has never even applied for approval with the Food and Drug Administration for use in the United States because their data is kind of crap. They had a problem during their phase 3 trial where a bunch of people got only a half a dose instead of a full dose. So they went back and gave more people another half a dose or another full dose, but they didn't do it in a large enough chunk of the studies to reach the numbers that the FDA required. So instead of having one big study, they had like 6 small ones. And because of that, the US is like, we'll work with the other ones until you figure that out. Novavax just applied and got approved in Canada. It's likely to be their dominant shot moving forward. And then the Johnson & Johnson one is the one I'm really excited about. It's the only one that's a single shot formula once and done, and it can be stored in a refrigerator, while the mRNA ones have to be stored in a freezer. So J&J is likely the one that's going to vaccinate most of the human population. Now, what this all tells me is right now, assuming no additional purchases, by the time we get to May 1st, there will be enough vaccines in distribution in the United States to fully vaccinate every American adult. We are likely to be able to get vaccines on a walk-in basis as soon as April 10. So this is almost done here. We'll then have a little bit of vaccine diplomacy with Canada and Mexico. We're actually shipping them some of our AstraZeneca shots right now. And both Mexico and Canada will then be fully immune probably by the end of July, maybe moving into mid-August for the Mexicans. And then we're done. Start worrying about boosters. But for the rest of the world, this is just the beginning. In fact, for the rest of the world, we're not even halfway. So the North American economic bloc recovers. But for the most part, no one else does. Now, say what you will about President Trump. One of the things he absolutely got right with his trade policy. And he set us up perfectly for this world that we're moving into. We have 5 trade deals: Mexico, Canada, South Korea, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Of those, the United Kingdom one is still in negotiation. It'll probably be finished this year. The others aren't simply signed, they're ratified, they've been implemented. And these are the 5 countries that you would want to be associated with in this world we're moving into. Collectively, they're the majority of our trade portfolio. Mexico, Canada, and the United Kingdom are going to be done with vaccinations on a schedule roughly in line with us. Korea and Japan have been very successful at keeping themselves virus-free. And as soon as they get the vaccinations, you know they're going to be effective at distributing them. And that's it. It's done. For everyone else, though, no. I want to focus on 2 specific trading partners so you have an idea what's coming on. Now, there are a lot of political disputes that we have with the Chinese. They are not going away. But there's a big strategic problem that the Chinese have that most people tend to overlook. And it's the islands on this map: Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. The Chinese call them the first island chain. And there has never been a point in Chinese history where the Chinese have been able to push past the chain and interact economically with the wider world, ever, with one exception. Right now, in the American-led order, because the Chinese were a Cold War ally and everyone is on the same side in the US-led order. All the US has to do, if the goal is to destroy China as a nation, is go home. And some version of that is on offer. For the Europeans, it's a numbers game. Now, this shows the ratio of people over age 65 to children. If you're in blue, you have more children. Blue and green, you have more children. If you're in yellow, orange, or red, you have more retirees. The United States, demographically speaking, is a very young country. We only have 4 states that have more retirees than children, and they're kind of the states you would expect. I mean, 3 of those are basically retirement communities anyway. So remember, blue is good, red is bad. Here's Europe. Europe aged past the point of demographic recovery 30 years ago, which means they've run out of young people to purchase the goods that they make. The EU is now an export union, and an export union cannot survive in a world without easy access to consumption-based markets in order to sell their products. A trade war with the Europeans was coming this year regardless of who won the election back in November. Let's talk manufacturing. This is total value-added manufacturing in the United States. The arrows indicate where the value-added parts come from. The numbers indicate their value in billions, and they're color-coded based on their likelihood of surviving a world where the United States is not holding up the ceiling. Anything that's green is fine. Anything in yellow, figure a quarter of the components by value aren't going to make it. Orange, half, and red, write it off. The US has a lot of green, a lot of yellow, and no red. Now that doesn't mean we're immune to what's coming, but when the total GDP exposure for the American economy is only about 10, 12%, that's not all that bad. We can grow through that, particularly with some help from the Mexicans. But the Germans can't. The Germans face a double bind. First, they have a lot more components that come from over the horizon, places that they cannot deal with, places where they don't have the capacity to enforce any sort of freedom of the seas or market access. The second problem is just as bad. The demographic situation of Europe in general, and Germany in the specific, is awful. They have to sell beyond the horizon as well. So everything about that engineering model will fail in the next few years. But it's nothing compared to the situation that the Chinese face. The Chinese are the most dependent of the major powers on foreign technology, foreign components, everything pretty much but the capital. Now, a lot of you have heard about the Made in China 2025 program, the idea that the Chinese are aiming to have technological equivalence with the Western world in just 5 years. Yeah, that's not what it means. If you can to a Chinese bureaucrat behind closed doors where their boss can't hear them, they will readily admit that 2025 is just the first step of a very long program, and that they don't actually expect to see technological equivalence until 2070. They don't have that kind of time, even if everything went perfectly. If you're looking for the country that is going to be the partner for the United States moving forward, it's not in Europe, and it's certainly not in Asia. We need to look a little closer to home. This is a climate map of the United States. That tan area in the middle, that is the temperate zone climate, makes up the bulk of the greater Midwest system, single largest chunk of arable land in the world. In addition, you've got that river system overlaying it, which drops the cost of transport through the floor. Floating things is about 1/12 the cost of moving them by truck. In addition, we've lakes to the north, forests to the north, mountains to the south, deserts to the south, oceans on both sides. We are the most insulated chunk of high quality land in the world. American success does not require decent leadership. I think we've learned that lesson over and over and over the last 30 years. It's the perfect, but compare it to Mexico. Northern Mexico is all desert, southern Mexico is all tropics, the middle is on an uplift that's about a vertical mile up. Infrastructure development in this sort of area is very difficult. Now, there's pros and cons to this system. It's laughable to think that the Mexicans can grow all their own food, particularly the closest to the US border you get where it's highland desert. It also means you got these population clusters that are very tight, no hinterland, because there's not a lot of agriculture. So you get an individual dude, a jefe, if you will, who kind of dominates everything in each individual urban center, especially once you get outside of the Mexican city core. Which means that if you're in a northern Mexican border city, or really anywhere north of the Central Plateau, you're on your own. And you have to reach out to find partners, and pretty much all of them reach north to Americans because we have the capital and the markets and the transport system. And that makes Mexico very, very different compared to the rest of Latin America. This is the trade portfolio of Peru. Everything on the right side indicates where the products go, and everything on the left side indicates what the products are by value. Those arrows are pointing to the value-added sections, mostly manufacturing. Peru is a standard Latin American country. A lot of low value-added products, a lot of ores, a little bit of agriculture, and that's about it. And most of it goes to China because China is a developing country, and it's ravenously bubbling up whatever resources it can in order to build out its physical infrastructure and industrial plant. This is the role of most of Latin America. Here's Mexico. Wildly different. Mexico has all kinds of stuff going for it. Lots of value added because they're integrated into American supply chains. And collectively, this makes Mexico not only more wealthy than Central America as a whole, but far more advanced technologically. It's an upwardly mobile country, and Americans enjoy privileged access to it. I'm going to leave you with a couple of series of thoughts. First of all, I'm actually a little worried about inflation right now. We've got a $1.9 trillion stimulus package. We've got a rapid reindustrialization. We've got rapid integration with the Mexicans. We have rapid manufacturing expansion as a result of COVID. And now we're about to have a massive COVID recovery. At the same time, people are also shuffling around and changing their living styles. All of this generates demand. We haven't seen this sort of inflationary impulse since at least the early 80s. Now, I don't think it's going to kill us, and all the things that we're doing are all things that we need to do, but doing them all at the same time is going to generate the greatest surge of inflation that we've seen in at least 40 years. That is going to have some implications politically down the road, and not all that far, like talking around like New Year's. Second, things are getting really interesting with the Russians. Now that the president is down on public record calling Putin a killer, because you know he is, we are now pretty much diametrically opposed with the Russians on absolutely everything. But unlike last time around, we don't have a lot of this at stake. Relationships with the Europeans are falling. We'll talk about that here in a second. The SolarWinds hack got really ugly, and now we have the American president publicly announcing that a massive counter campaign in terms of cyber is imminent. It's kind of a weird thing to announce publicly if you ask me, but I'm really interested to see how this is going to turn out. Anyway, relations have collapsed in every possible measure, which means that, and since we don't have an interest in maintaining stability in Russian relations anymore, we can use a lot of tools that we haven't used in the past. So we can, for example, target energy exports from the Russians, not caring what the impact on the Europeans happens to be. I expect that to get really interesting in just a couple of months. Third, Persian Gulf. It's an energy question. Now, there is a lot of criticism of the Obama administration's deal with the Iranians. I broadly mirror a lot of those concerns. And the team that is in charge of Biden's foreign policy, it was actually their idea back during the Obama administration to have this deal. But then the Obama team took it and ran with it and kind of punted it. So they fully realize what went wrong and why. And they also can acknowledge publicly that the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign had the desired effect. It absolutely smashed the Iranian economy. So they want a new deal, but they don't want a deal that doesn't reflect these changes. So it's going to be a lot more strict if it happens. The Iranians, of course, want the old deal back, and they've been trying to get America's attention and trying to generate chips that they can trade. Because without those oil sales that the Trump administration has prevented, Iran has lost the capacity to manipulate the region in the way that it prefers. A lot of the militia groups that they've sponsored in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq only do what they're told when the Iranians pay them, and right now the Iranians can't pay them. So the Iranians are looking for other leverage. Around New Year's, they hijacked a South Korean chemicals tanker in order to get the Americans' attention. The Trump administration did nothing, but then the Biden administration came in and did nothing. We don't care. Shale revolution has made the United States completely agnostic on global energy policy, which means if you're Iran, you have to up your game. US probably still isn't going to care. But we now have the Americans likely to throw energy sanctions on the Russians. At the same time, the Iranians are likely to up their game in the Gulf. That's a perfect storm for global energy policy. It just doesn't affect the US. Everyone else, though. Next, meet Catherine Tai. She was just confirmed as the new US Trade Representative. Now, the USTR is responsible for a lot of things, but the top of the list is negotiating new trade deals. Ms. Tai has no experience doing that whatsoever. She's never been involved in a significant international organizational treaty negotiation, and she's never even managed a large staff. She was a congressional staffer until very recently. That tells me everything I need to know about the Biden trade plans. Aside from a deal with the UK, there aren't going to be any. Now, the other part of the USTR's job is to prosecute trade cases against countries that violate the spirit and the letter of American trade law. And for that, Catherine Tai is wildly well qualified. She worked for the USTR's office under Obama. Her primary job was to sue China. I think you can see where this is going. The goal here for the Biden team is not to expand the trade system, but to concentrate it and sue the hell out of anyone who doesn't agree with American law. Next up, Europe. You guys remember a few years ago when the Californians and then ultimately the federal authorities sued BMW and Volkswagen for cheating on air emissions tests? Basically, the Germans had specifically designed their vehicles to detect when they were being tested for smog and to change the way that they operate so they could fool the test. That's actually not illegal in the United States, but it is illegal in Europe. So the Europeans were sued in European courts by American jurisprudence. And of course, the Americans won because the Germans actually had been lying. Some version of that is about to happen with human rights as regards the Chinese and as regards the Russians. We're going to use European law to sue them in their own courts for violations of their own laws. At the same time, we're going to have a trade war. Relations with the Europeans are going to hit a new low. There is no sign that the Biden administration is looking to shore up the alliance system in any meaningful way. Our relations have been diverging for a while now, and it will be under Biden that we experience a formal breach because no one can say, oh, this is just Trump. If somebody who's been involved in American politics for 50 years, who is the anti-Trump, is the one who makes these policies happen, this is real and this is permanent. And then finally, there's China. The relations with the Chinese are getting ugly very, very quickly. We have a lot of things that are going horribly wrong. On his way out the door, Donald Trump rolled a couple of grenades into this relationship. He called what was going on in Xinjiang a genocide because, you know, it is. And he said that any American diplomat at any level can go to Taiwan without needing prior approval and can do so as a formal representative of the US government, which is about that far away from formal recognition. His first day on the job, Trump's policies were reaffirmed by incoming President Biden. Biden also reaffirmed every tariff and sanction the Trump administration had put on any Chinese entity. That includes sanctions on the Chinese equivalent of Chevron. We now have new policies on Hong Kong and Tibet. In his first week, Biden ordered 2 American aircraft carrier battle groups to sail through the South China Sea and do military exercises within sight of the islands that the Chinese claim. And then there's also Catherine Tai, who is Taiwanese. The Chinese perceive this as a full court press, and they are not wrong. And don't forget about developments on the other side of the Pacific. What growth the Chinese had in calendar year 2020 wasn't from consumption, it wasn't really from exports, it was mostly inventory builds. It's like end-around style growth. That's not sustainable and that's not healthy. In addition, Chinese know that their demography is sharply terminal, and they know that their economic model is collapsing. So they are closing ranks, they are demonizing outsiders, and they are hunkering down for a Maoist-style political collapse, hoping that they can hold the line for a Maoist-style dictatorship. American and Chinese officials are exchanging barbs in Alaska as we speak. Things do not seem to be going well. I expect not just a breach with the Europeans this year, but a full-on trade war and a breach with the Chinese this year. And if there's one thing that pretty much everyone across the entire American political spectrum agrees on, is that the relations with the Chinese need to get worse. And the one faction that might disagree with that is the business community, and right now they are political orphans. If you're looking for places that the Americans are going to care about moving forward, this is the list. Every country that is lit up has two things going for it. First, they've got positive demographies, which suggest consumption-based growth is possible for at least another 30 years. Second, they have relatively easy access to energy supply, so they can keep the lights on in a world where the US isn't patrolling. What's different about the two colors is that if you're in blue, you really don't have any significant security concerns, internal or external, and if you're green, you do. Now, we're all aware of what the murder rate is in Mexico and how the drug war is nasty. They're still blue. That gives you an idea of where the threshold is. If you're looking for countries that are going to need to be defended, that the US is going to care about, this is probably the whole list. A few quick call outs. First of all, Western Hemisphere is going to kind of have a cordon sanitaire. The US won't allow anyone from the outside to play. Mexico obviously is our firmest partner in this. Second, Southeast Asia, relatively positive demographies. They have most of the resources they need locally. And as the Chinese system and the Northeast Asian system breaks down, these are the logical beneficiaries. And then third, it's worth taking a good close look at Southeast Asia. India is never going to be the next China, but India is also not going to disintegrate like China is. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an ally, but it certainly can be a partner moving forward. Okay, that's everything from me. If you're looking at something to throw at your neighbor, here are the books. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. The handle's right there. And I have a newsletter that comes out, let's just call it irregularly, based on my schedule and whatever happens to be going on in the world. It is free. It will always be free. And I'm always happy to have whoever wants to forward it to whoever they want to, whenever. Okay, that's it. I think we still have some time for questions, and I don't have a call for quite some time. So we're going to go as long as you guys want to.
All right, Peter, thank you very, very much indeed. Excellent presentation. We do have some lightning round questions for you. So here we go. There are several hundred people who are congregating after having walked hundreds of miles to park on our borders to enter the United States and seek either political asylum or some sort of safe harbor from the genocide they're facing in their countries and pursue the American dream. So I want you to put yourself in the West Wing of the White House right now. And President Biden comes and says, Peter,
I mean, the solution here is shockingly simple. We need immigration reform, but that's a congressional prerogative. We haven't had meaningful immigration change in this country since 1986. The category of asylum is one that was included in that law because it was Cold War propaganda. People who were basically being invited from the former Soviet Empire to the United States so they could get preferential treatment. Obviously, the Cold War ended a while ago. In the short term, the solution is something that actually I think the Biden administration may have figured out. They're putting tent cities down in the Central American countries to process claims there. Anything that puts the sharp end of the American immigration system as close to the communities where people are scared and leaving as possible is going to, at a minimum, provide better intelligence to the United States for the scope of the problem. But remember that this wave of people that's coming up right now, they're not fleeing any specific political prosecution. I'm not saying it's a lovely place in Central America, but that's not what this is about. They got hit by 2 Class 5 hurricanes back to back in October and November. It takes 2 months to walk to the border. There literally is nothing left in most of Central America. These people have had better medical care and better food and better security while walking through Mexico for the last 2 months than they have at home, which means that they were going to come no matter what happened on November 6th. We need a policy that addresses for that. I'd say President Carter probably had the best policy in the past. Last time when he was in charge and hurricanes hit the area, he sent immigration officials down to basically offer 3-year work permits. And if you check in with your officer and you pay your taxes and keep your nose clean, at the end of 3 years, you can either get a free ticket home or get a path towards citizenship or renew the work permit. So we made it in everyone's best interest to participate in the system rather than avoid it. And until we can kind of flip that switch, we're going to have some version of this.
Right. So Todd Roberts asks an excellent follow-up question, Peter. He says, what do you consider the motivating factors behind the Biden administration's approach to immigration that has manifested in the current situation on the border? Is there anything that's a driving factor that you're seeing?
Unfortunately, it seems to me that the driving factor is to disassociate the Biden administration in the United States from anything that Trump named. So, for example, the camps on the border that the United States under the Trump administration famously put kids in. We don't put kids in anymore. We put families in because we changed the name of the facility. The Remain in Mexico program, where we forced people to wait in Mexico to process their asylum claims, that's gone. So now we're just forcing people into Mexico to stay. It's stay in Mexico instead of remain in Mexico, but we're not taking their information because remain in Mexico is gone. So if anything, the Biden administration's policies are actually more draconian, but they've got different PR.
Crazy. Craig Marvany, one of our members in Cleveland, Ohio, and a member of our board, writes, in early 2018, Peter, you spoke of an anticipated hot war with China that would likely start like right about now. What are we looking at in the coming, sorry, I didn't mean to catch you there in mid-gulp. What are we looking at in the coming years on this? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to rule out a hot war. I don't think it's going to happen because I don't think the Chinese are that stupid. I think the people that are at the top.
What is a hot war?
Well, you know, when it gets kinetic, when we start shooting at one another.
Got it.
Yeah, I think President Xi realizes, I think President Xi sees China more from my point of view than from the propaganda point of view. I think he realizes the financial, the economic, the demographic, and the strategic weakness. And I think he knows that if he pushes the United States too far, and if anything about this becomes kinetic at all, the United States isn't going to engage the Chinese Navy within sight of the Chinese mainland where the Chinese Air Force can come into play. You know, that's the scenario that we always see in the news where the US Navy is like, oh, we can't beat them under any scenario. You don't fight China within range of China. China is a trading nation. They import 80% of their oil. You send a few destroyers off into the Indian Ocean, you just prevent the crude from getting through. Done. China collapses in less than 2 months. That's how that would go. And I think Xi knows that. The concern I have is that when it becomes obvious, not just to the CCP, but to the average Chinese citizen, that this is over, that this isn't working, that they are looking at a deindustrialization process as one of their better case scenarios as the global system falls apart, that they'll make a bid for Taiwan. Because while their military can't hold a candle to the United States in any sort of real fight, it was designed to take on Taiwan, and it can do that, assuming no one else gets involved. Of course, countries would get involved. Even if the US decides to sit it out, the Japanese will be involved, and that will cause a collapse of the Chinese system just as quickly as the American system, because the Japanese can reach the Indian Ocean, but the Chinese can't. It's over 85, 90% of the Chinese Navy can't sail past the first island chain. They don't have the capacity to protect what they need to. I don't think that they would risk their national survival in order to get a last ditch thumb their nose at the world. The Russians certainly didn't. But there's always a chance that the top tier will believe their own propaganda. That's my biggest concern.
Okay, cool. John Jennings, Peter, is one of our corporate council members in Scottsdale, Arizona, and has written in, Peter, can you please elaborate on the conditions and implications of China moving to a new Maoist model, as you described, and what is the likelihood of that?
The way it will probably go is the Chinese system is, I don't want to say it's an economic freefall, but it's certainly in bad shape. And every restriction that every country puts on them for manufacturing supply chains, of which there are now legion, takes another chunk out of the system, because it means there's less and less propensity for employment. And the way that the Chinese have maintained social stability going back decades has been to make sure that everybody has a job, especially if they don't have a productive skill, and especially if there's no product to produce. So we get a lot of overproduction in pretty much every sector. That has global consequences. And now the world has pushed back against that to prevent the export of all this overproduction. So it's all getting bottled up in the Chinese system, which means that the debt has exploded. It's their national debt by measures of corporate bad debt is now up over 350% of GDP, which is far worse than what the Japanese had at their crash back in 1989. So we're looking at a full-scale economic and financial meltdown. So what the Chinese have been doing is concentrating power more and more, first in the Communist Party, then in the Politburo, and then in the personage of Xi. That's part of why they amended their constitution so that he could run forever, which he will do. In that environment, Maoist thought, Xi Jinping thought is now a thing. And the degree to which they have consolidated political ideology under the person of President Xi is far tighter than anything that ever happened under Mao. And the only reason that the consequences haven't been worse is the economy is, at least for now, still growing, and China is an industrialized society. But I don't expect that's going to last much longer. So rather than China lashing out, I expect them to lash in and form a hard shell around the country that basically information and people can't get in or out. And the system will just kind of sink economically. If they can keep that sinking under control, China can retain its identity as a single nation. If you happen to not be Han in that environment, that's a disaster. We're already seeing the leading edges of that. It's going to be a very ugly near and midterm future for the country. But as long as the United States kind of allows energy to come in, the lights stay on, the country stays industrialized. But as soon as that goes away, China reverts to something a lot more similar to the 1970s than anything else that we've seen recently.
So likely timing on all this, Peter, what do you see? A year?
That is the question, honestly, is going to be, we're going to know tomorrow whether or not the Alaska meeting among the national security and foreign officials was sufficiently friendly to generate a summit or not. My gut tells me no. And one of the things about Biden that I really like is he's a straight talker, and he's not a very good diplomat. He says things how they are. And the things that he's saying on China suggest that we're going to really ratchet down the trade policies this year. China can't give in to the things that Biden wants. It would destroy the CCP. So it's just a question of how the Chinese react. They can either go through a multi-decade, slow motion, slouching economic collapse. It's a little worse than what the Japanese have done in the last 30 years. Or they can challenge the system and risk a complete collapse as the system, the American system, reacts. We should know how that is going to go within the next 3 months.
Okay, excellent. Peter, we have time for one last question, and it comes from our past president, Elizabeth Laurel in New Jersey. She writes, Peter, can you please comment on the number of male versus females in China and the impact that that will have on China's strength or lack thereof in the future?
Well, China has the world's largest army right now because it has a lot of excess males. Based on who's doing the math, it's somewhere between 40 and 70 million. That's obviously not great for long-term population growth, but as we saw with the birth rate last year, we're already well past the point of no return there. There is a theory being discussed that when you've got so many males, you have a vested interest in throwing them into a military conflict so that they don't come back and rebel. There's a certain logic to that, but the problem is, who would they throw them at? Can't throw them at Taiwan. That's a naval battle. That requires a lot less manpower intensive military force. Navies just don't take as many people as armies. They could throw them against Russia, but Russia's standing policy is, if you try anything cute like that, we're not even going to try to meet you on the field of battle. We're just going to nuke you. They could go against Kazakhstan, but again, what would the winner get? And that just leaves Vietnam. And the Vietnamese gave them the same warm, friendly welcome back in 1979 that they gave us. And the Chinese have no interest in going back there. They can't get to India because of the mountain ranges. So really, if this is a social problem, it's one they don't have a solution for outside of propaganda. But as we have seen on multiple occasions, if you have really, really, really nationalist propaganda like China does, and for whatever reason you have to back down, sometimes the population doesn't go along. We're seeing that in the United States right now with some of Trump's more fervent supporters. We actually have a not insignificant group of Trumpists who are now calling for Trump's execution, saying that he's a liberal because he took the COVID vaccine. I can only imagine, in the information vacuum that exists in China, how big a group like that could get.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Peter, this has been tremendous. I know some of our members are going to need to drop off because we're at the hour, but since you don't have another call, can you take a couple of other questions that have just come? Yeah, cool. All right. So folks, if you need to drop off, thank you so much for being with us today. We really do appreciate the courtesy of your time. But for those who are interested in wanting to stay on, we're going to have a couple last questions with Peter, and this recording will be in our Friday Fives and on FDCC on demand, so you can pick it up if you need to leave us now. But again, thanks so much on behalf of our president, Mike Glascott, and the board for coming. So this next question, Peter, comes from Joseph Martin in Illinois. American domestic politics question, Peter. In the next decade, will American politics tone down? Will the right and left become even more pronounced, or will the majority population be forced back on its heels even more so by all of the country's minority population?
Let me dispel a myth, two myths. Myth number one, minorities. The idea that the minorities are polarized. They're really not. They might have a little bit sharper voting breakdown than the white majority, but not by much. A big problem of that is that a lot of Hispanics, especially once they hit second generation, self-identify as white. They see it as a term indicating that you have made it, rather than a racial term, which makes a collection of data a little difficult. Add in that most minorities are actually fairly socially conservative, and we just don't have that split that that the media would seem to suggest. Second, the media has been telling us that we're more split than ever, which is total crap. If you look at the voting logs from the most recent presidential election, and you break it down by voting group, whether that's by ethnicity or by state or by socioeconomic status or educational status, there's some really interesting stuff in there. So for example, Vermont, generally considered the most liberal state, a state where they think that Bernie Sanders is barely tolerable because he's so conservative. 30% of the population voted for Trump. In Wyoming, where half the population are working cowboys, 30% of the population voted for Biden. Those were the two most extreme states. And that ratio, 30% voting for the other guy, is actually higher than the 50-year average. We're actually less likely to be polarized as a nation now than we've been before. What's changed is social media. The people that we normally lock in the basement because they're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs have bullhorns now, and they have been able to dominate the noise and the conversation. So the solution here isn't no more Trump or no more Biden or more Biden. The solution is to figure out how to manage social media in a more productive way. We've done this before. We've dealt with this before. The last big time that we had a democratization of information exchange, if you will, is when the telegraph came in. Back then, we had a little guy by the name of Pulitzer, if you remember him, who just started making shit up about the Spanish, and it got us into a war. Now, we got Cuba out of that. We got the Philippines out of that. It was an easy war, but still, it probably shouldn't have happened. And as a result of Pulitzer's actions, we started getting things like libel laws. We need some equivalent of that for social media, which means that the 1996 Telecommunications Act has to be amended so that social media platforms can't be used in their current manner. That is a job, unfortunately, for Congress. No one can decide where to draw the lines except for Congress.
Okay, cool. Two last questions. And it's always dangerous for lawyers to say, Your Honor, I just have one last question, because it's never true. But I think in this case, it's going to be. Steve Case, who is one of our great members of Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company out in Indiana, writes, Peter, what do you think would be the United States' biggest potential misstep regarding how we are currently positioned?
If we screw up relations with Mexico, we will regret that for a century. They're our largest trading partner. They will become our tightest intermingled demographic group within the decade. They are our number one security partner, and we have a lot of common problems when it comes to things like immigration, the drug war, tariffs, all of it. If we get that relationship right, all of our other problems are pretty minor. But if we screw that up, yikes. When we move out of a globalized system where we've got like 30 countries that we care about any given time, and Mexico's at like number 27, it's not a big deal. But in a post-globalized system, when we only really care about 5 countries and Mexico's number 1, that should be a relationship we get right. I've got some concerns about the current president, AMLO. He's a populist leftist who has some very serious authoritarian streaks. He got along great with Trump. Relations with Biden are getting off to a little bit of a rocky start, but nothing disastrous. But if we get that one right, everything else is something where we'll have Mexico's back. I mean, think about it. The United States has the healthiest demography in the developed world, and Mexico has the healthiest demography in the developing world. So we are going to be dealing with each other for the next century, regardless of anything that else goes down. I'd rather have that be friendly. In the broader world, I'm really not all that concerned. There's a culture shift that we're going to have to adapt to. We have been the agent, the guarantor of global order since 1945. And we're now, bit by bit, not just dropping that, but inverting it and becoming an agent of disorder. Because global chaos is actually really good for the United States, because most countries can't reach us, can't even pretend to reach us. They have interests much closer to home. And anything that keeps the rest of the world busy with the rest of the world gives the United States all kinds of strategic freedom. But adopting a French-style strategic policy is something that our defense establishment is not trained for. And that's going to require some very strong leadership from the top and a lot of very clear directives on things like rules of engagement that we're just not used to. That's not going to happen overnight, and I'm not sure Biden is even thinking that way right now, but the way our policy went under Obama and then under Trump and now under Biden is clearly pushing us in that direction. I would rather have our military and our intelligence assets prepared for that rather than it just being tossed in their lap to see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of Congress, do you have a prediction for the midterm elections? Will the Democrats?
No, because I don't even have I don't even have a prediction for what the Democratic and Republican coalition is going to look like now. Too much is in motion internal to the parties. The fact that we've got factions of the Trump coalition now advocating against Trump is kind of emblematic of how much churn we have right now. So until that settles out a little bit, I can't make a prediction. But about a year from now, we'll be starting the primaries for the midterms. And that'll give us a really good idea of just what sort of coalitions are emerging as we go through this journey.
Excellent. All right, Peter, last question comes from our President-elect Bob Christie out in Seattle, Washington. He writes, and Peter, how does climate change play into your forecast, especially in light of the rising waters and human migration forced by these changes?
That's a work in progress for me. It's easy for me to say climate change is happening, but you can't just say raising temperatures and rising sea levels and expect me to tell you what's going to go down on a zip code level. One of the problems with predicting climate change effects is all politics are local, all geopolitics are local. And you can have a situation that is a net negative for the planet that's a net positive for some geography. So a couple examples real quick. Consider Australia. Last summer before last, they had horrible wildfires, the worst in their history, devastated their tourism, devastated their agriculture. It was a really crap year. The problem is, of course, that they're getting more thermal radiation from the sun. It dried out an area that was already arid, excuse me. As a result, the whole place was a tinderbox and it got lit, and something like 1 billion acres and billions of animals were killed. It was just awful. Consider Illinois. Had the same temperature increase, but it's a different climate zone. It's not arid, it's humid continental. So for Australia, the temperature increase was primarily during the day. In Illinois, it's primarily at night, which meant that Illinois now has 25 fewer frost and freeze nights than it did 50 years ago. It also means they're getting more water instead of less because it's a humid climate, which means that if this path continues, sometime this decade, most farmers in Illinois are going to be able to double crop. We're only now getting good enough data to start to make these differentiations and realize, how bad it gets in some places, how good it gets in some places. And then we have to look at the entire map of the world with fresh eyes, because the baseline will have changed for everything. This suggests Dry places get drier, hot places get hotter, wet places get wetter. That's really bad for India. That's horrible for Brazil. That's horrible for Australia. It's wonderful for New Zealand. It's wonderful for the Midwest. It's wonderful for the East Coast. It's horrible for California. It's great for Seattle. It's, you know, we're having to learn this all over again. But what I can guarantee you is that the parts of the world that didn't develop on their own before the global order started in 1945, they didn't develop on their own for good reason. Their geographies aren't as stable. They're not as wealthy. They're not as temperate. Those are the places that are likely to get hit harder by what's coming. And then you just have to look at whether the people can walk somewhere else. In the United States, the only people who can walk here are in Mexico, where they had a baby bust 20 years ago, and we've had net negative migration from Mexico for 11 years now. Or Central America, where the baby bust started later, but is much more intense. So we're probably only going to face another 10 years of that migration. They're just going to run out of people. That's it for North America. That's done. But, you know, you're looking at the African continent getting really ugly, and you're looking at the Middle East getting really ugly, and all those people can walk to Europe. So whether it's with demographics or whether it's climate science, the United States is going to be able to look out across the world and make decisions based on what works and what doesn't everywhere else. We have the most valuable resource available to us right now. We have time. That's just not something that anyone else has.
Fascinating. Peter, can't thank you enough. Appreciate your time, your expertise. Very thought-provoking, as we're seeing people writing in here in the chat room. You've given us a lot to think about. I think I probably will hit Amazon to get the Disunited Nations and the Accidental Superpower books immediately to give myself some additional reading materials. For those of you who have not yet had an opportunity to do so, Peter's blog is excellent and his email is excellent. You can sign up for them both at Zeihan.com. Please feel free to do that at your convenience. But for now, Peter, thank you again for being with us today and giving us the benefit of your expertise. We really, really do appreciate it. And we hope you stay safe and well out there in Colorado. And please give our best to Susan.
My pleasure. You guys take care.
All right, you too, Peter. Thanks very much. All right, folks, we're going to come to the end of our presentation here today. So I'm just going to very quickly introduce our president, Mike Glascott, whose last parting words to us when we were all together at the annual meeting virtually, when we were supposed to be in Bermuda, I think really summed up what we have seen over the last several months. And that was that old African proverb that Mike endowed us with, which was, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And from everything that we have seen happen in the Federation over the last several months, we've really gone far. And with Bob Christie and Howard Merton coming on over the course of the next 2 years, we're going to go even farther. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today. Mike, I'll toss it back over to you for the wrap up.
Guys, just real quickly, we had a lot of fun putting this together. I hope you enjoyed Peter Zeihan's presentation. I think we'll all be thinking about it and perhaps losing a little sleep over it tonight. But I hope you all enjoyed it, and we will see you at the Greenbrier. Stay safe.